I was 16 when I first understood what loneliness really meant, not as a feeling but as a way of life. My parents, both corporate lawyers ascending the steel tower of their firm, had perfected the art of parental absence. Our Brooklyn brownstone on Prospect Heights became a museum of their success. Original hardwood floors, exposed brick walls, a sub-zero refrigerator we rarely filled together. But it was hollow in the way beautiful things become hollow when no one's around to share them. Friday nights were the worst. I'd watch them prepare for their galas and firm events, my mother in designer dresses that whispered when she moved, my father adjusting his cufflinks with the precision he applied to legal briefs. "We'll be late," my mother would call out, checking her phone for the third time. And then they'd be gone, leaving me with Netflix and the weight of a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. That October in 2019, I was suffocating on their success. I'd noticed Derek Matthews around the building before, the graduate student living 2 floors below in the railroad apartment that everyone said had a revolving door of tenants. He was 21, possessed the kind of effortless charm that made people want to please him, and seemed genuinely interested in talking to me when we encountered each other in the hallway. After I helped him move boxes from a U-Haul one Saturday afternoon, shoulders burning, sweat dripping down my back, he invited me over casually. "Friday night? We could play some board games," he'd said, as if he were offering me water in the desert. I get tired of my own company, you know? I did know. I knew it intimately. That Friday, I descended the 2 flights to Derek's apartment feeling something I hadn't felt in months: anticipation. The maze-like layout of the railroad apartment fascinated me. Interconnected rooms sprawling in unexpected directions, hidden corners, shadowed alcoves that seemed to multiply with each new hallway. It felt like a place where secrets could live comfortably. "The layout's great for games," Derek said, watching my face as I explored. "Lots of places to hide." He'd smiled then, and I'd smiled back, too desperate for connection to notice anything strange in his tone. We started with K-10, but Derek kept steering us toward hide-and-seek. "It'll be more fun," he insisted, setting boundaries with surprising specificity. "No basement, no locked rooms, and no small closets. I mean it, Marcus. Don't hide in anything tight." The precision of his instructions should have triggered something in me, but instead I felt chosen. He was taking care of me, setting rules to protect me. Or so I told myself. The first 2 rounds were innocent enough, but in the 3rd round, something fractured. Derek had claimed he'd checked under the bed but couldn't find me, even though I was there, holding my breath, watching his shoes move past. "I know you're somewhere," he called out, his voice oddly calm. Then I heard it. Footsteps from multiple directions at once. Heavy footsteps from the hallway. Lighter ones from what sounded like the kitchen. A creaking sound from somewhere that shouldn't have anything behind it. I emerged then, heart hammering against my ribs. "There's no one else here," I said, more as a question than a statement. Derek's expression shifted, just for a moment, a flicker of something I couldn't name. Then he laughed. "Old building. Pipes, you know. Sounds travel weirdly." But they didn't just travel. They multiplied. We were wrapping up, the apartment suddenly feeling too small and too large at the same time, when Derek's phone buzzed. His face changed in an instant, genuine concern flickering across his features. "Family emergency," he said, already moving toward the door. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. Really. Something's come up." He texted me later. "Don't mention tonight to anyone, okay? Family situation is complicated." I lay awake that night in my parents' brownstone, unable to sleep. At 2 a.m. I heard footsteps outside our apartment door. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The kind someone makes when they're looking for something, or someone. I pressed myself against the wall, watching the shadow beneath the door, my breath barely moving. They stopped directly outside, lingered for what felt like an eternity, then continued down the hallway. The next day, I visited Derek's building and found Mr. Vega, the superintendent, watering the plants in the lobby. I tried to sound casual. "Derek seems cool. How long's he been in that apartment?" Mr. Vega glanced up, and something in his expression made me understand he'd seen this before. Kids asking questions about Derek Matthews. 3 months this time, he said carefully. That place has a reputation. People don't stay long. Something spooks them. There was a woman, decades back, fell down the stairs. He didn't say more, but he didn't need to. I scrolled through Derek's Instagram that night, searching for something I couldn't articulate. 8 months back, he'd posted a photo with a group of college-aged men at what looked like a retreat or retreat center. All of them smiling at the camera, positioned close together. The caption read, "More memories to come." One comment caught my eye. "Where are you hiding out now?" Derek's response was chilling in its simplicity. "New place, same program." When I finally called Derek, he was clipped, distant. "I need to deal with some stuff, Marcus. Don't contact me." The line went dead. 3 months later, Mr. Vega called our apartment. Derek had moved out suddenly, but there was more. A family nearby had reported their child coming home terrified after visiting an apartment a few blocks over to help someone move. The superintendent had recognized the pattern and called around, concerned. "I'm 18 now, applying to colleges as far from New York as I can manage." I'll never know Derek's true intentions, whether I was being tested for recruitment into something darker, whether he was collecting experiences or collecting something else entirely. The game that night wasn't a game at all. It was an audition, and I'd been found lacking in some crucial way. Or perhaps I'd simply gotten lucky. But what I know with certainty is that danger doesn't announce itself. It arrives dressed in charm and casual invitations. It comes from people who seem genuinely interested in you, who notice your loneliness and offer exactly what you're starving for. The most important lesson I've learned isn't about Derek, or hidden intentions, or predators hiding in apartment buildings. It's this: loneliness will make you believe that any connection is better than no connection. It will whisper that you're being paranoid, that it's just an old building making strange sounds, that isolation is worse than risk. But the truth is more complicated. We don't grow by seeking connection anywhere we can find it. We grow by learning to trust not just others, but our own instincts when something feels wrong. And we survive not by abandoning our need for human contact, but by being honest about the warning signs we feel in our bones. Derek taught me that, not through friendship, but through fear. And sometimes, that's the only language certain people understand. For 30 years, the Whitmore Regional Library was my sanctuary. Built in 1890 with soaring ceilings that seemed to reach toward some higher understanding, it was where I had constructed my entire existence. My name is Thomas Rothstein, and I'm 53 years old, though some days I feel ancient, hollowed out, like a book whose spine has been broken too many times. People always assumed I was happy. How could I not be? Surrounded by first editions, by the smell of aging paper and leather bindings, by the perfect order of cataloged knowledge. My herb garden at home thrived under my careful attention. I'd never married, never felt the need. I'd read extensively in philosophy and psychology, Kant, Freud, William James. I was rational, logical, superior to those who needed mysticism or religion to explain the world. I was arrogant, is what I was. December 2018 started like any other winter in Vermont. The snow came early and heavy, but I welcomed it. On December 15th, I stayed late at the library after an inventory session. The books needed me. I always told myself the books needed me. Maybe I just needed to be needed. By the time I realized the blizzard had turned catastrophic, the roads were already impassable. The power died around 8 p.m. The phone lines came down an hour later. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt relief. The world had stopped. It was just me in the library, exactly as I'd always wanted it. By the second day, the darkness had become absolute. I'd found the emergency candles, but they only made the shadows deeper. The library transformed into something else entirely. Rows of books became towering sentinels. The corridors stretched and twisted in my perception. The silence was so complete it had weight. That's when I first heard my mother's voice. Thomas. It was her exactly. That slight rasp she'd developed after the pneumonia, the musical rise at the end of my name. Thomas, where are you? I remember standing very still in the reading room, candle held before me like a talisman. Stress-induced auditory hallucinations, I told myself, recalling a chapter from a neuroscience book I'd read 3 years prior. Isolation triggers parasympathetic responses. Your amygdala is misfiring. I was talking myself out of fear with the language of reason, a trick that had worked my entire life. The voice faded, but on the third day, everything collapsed. I found things moved. Books I distinctly remembered shelving, in specific locations, specific positions, had migrated to different sections. The Victorian novels were mixed with the philosophy texts. My pen, a silver-plated cross my father had given me, appeared in a locked drawer I hadn't opened in months. My hands shook as I stared at it. "This isn't happening," I whispered to the darkness. The darkness didn't answer, but the voices did. My college roommate's laugh, that distinctive snort he'd made, echoed through the stacks like it was being played through invisible speakers. Conversations from my past manifested in the shadows. Arguments with my brother about my mother's estate, words I'd never told anyone, moments I'd sealed away decades ago. And then came the final violation. The voices revealed things. Personal, terrible things. My mother's last words, not "I love you," as I'd told people my entire life, but something harder, something about disappointment. An incident from childhood I'd buried so deeply I'd convinced myself it never happened. The reason my brother hadn't spoken to me in 15 years, secrets wrapped around my identity like chains. I sat on the floor of the reference section surrounded by candles and I wept. By the fourth day, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I saw faces flickering in the empty reading rooms, my mother's translucent features, my father's stern expression, a girl named Sarah from high school who'd asked me to dance and whom I'd rejected with cold precision. The line between hallucination and memory dissolved entirely. The library wasn't containing me anymore. It was consuming me. I found the letter opener in the circulation desk. Silver handle, 3 inches of sharp blade. I kept it close to me, hidden beneath my coat. Not for harm, I told myself, for protection. But protection from what? Ghosts? My own mind? The distinction had stopped mattering. When the rescue team found me on the 6th day, I was incoherent, paranoid, convinced they were part of the library's trick. They had to subdue me. The letter opener clattered to the floor. I was taken away like something dangerous, something broken. The psychiatric evaluation found no psychotic disorder, no permanent disconnection from reality. Just trauma, just fear, just the human mind pushed to a breaking point by 5 days of absolute isolation. They prescribed anti-anxiety medication. They recommended hospitalization. I refused. I insisted I was fine. I was lying to them and to myself. I returned to work for 3 months, but I couldn't function. Every shadow held threat. My peripheral vision played tricks. I'd turn quickly, convinced something was moving just outside my direct gaze. The medication helped, but it was like wearing a blanket over a fire. The heat was still there, just muffled. By March 2019, I'd resigned. I moved to Portland, Oregon, to noise, to people, to the opposite of silence. I work night shifts in a warehouse now, surrounded by the constant hum of machinery and the presence of other workers. The voices are gone, but I'm not the same. My rationality, which I'd worn like armor, cracked irreparably in that dark library. I can't dismiss the irrational anymore. I can't pretend that the mind isn't fragile, that isolation isn't dangerous, that knowledge alone can protect us. Here's what I've learned. Solitude and silence aren't neutral. They're forces. We evolved as social creatures, and when you remove that element entirely, your own consciousness becomes both your greatest asset and your most dangerous enemy. The mind, left without external input, begins to generate its own. It doesn't distinguish between real and false, it just fills the void. I advocate now for mental health screenings in solitary positions, night security guards, lighthouse keepers, isolated librarians. Not because the isolated are weak, but because we're all human. We all have a breaking point. The voices stopped years ago, but I hear them sometimes in dreams. More terrifying than any ghost is the realization that the most dangerous adversary wasn't in the library that week in December. It was always me. I'm still medicated, still functional, still changed. And I know now that the greatest gift we can give each other isn't knowledge or order or understanding. It's presence. It's the simple acknowledgement that we're not meant to be alone in the dark, that our minds, for all their brilliance, need connection the way our bodies need air. The Whitmore Regional Library still stands, full of endless corridors and soaring ceilings. But I'll never go back. Some sanctuaries, I've learned, are actually prisons, and sometimes the most real demons are the ones only we can see. I've never been good at leaving things broken. Maybe that comes from growing up in a house that was fundamentally fractured. Dad disappearing for months at a time, Mom working doubles at the hospital and nights as a bartender, leaving me alone in our cramped apartment with nothing but the sound of the refrigerator's tired hum. While other kids played, I cooked. I'd create entire 3-course meals from whatever I could find in our cabinets, transforming chaos into something beautiful and ordered. It was the only thing I could control. By my late 20s, that need for control had evolved into something more refined. I'd gone to culinary school, built a small freelance business hosting intimate dinner parties and catering events from my home kitchen, every sauce perfectly balanced, every pastry shell achieving the exact right shatter when your fork broke through it. I'd saved for 5 years to buy the house on Riverside Drive in Austin, a charming 1950s bungalow with good bones and a price tag I could almost afford. The real estate agent called it a fixer-upper. I called it home. When March 2020 hit and lockdown shuttered the city, I did what I'd always done. I began to build. The kitchen renovation was supposed to be my masterpiece, a dream workspace with commercial-grade equipment and custom cabinetry. I started by gutting the original cabinets, sweating through the pandemic in an N95 mask, my drill whining as I systematically dismantled decades of previous lives. It was while removing the cabinet beneath the sink that I felt it. Something solid taped to the wooden supports. My hands, dusty and cramped, worked it free. An old brass key tarnished to the color of aged bronze, with a weight that suggested intention. Someone had hidden this deliberately. The realization sent something cold sliding down my spine, though I told myself I was being ridiculous. Probably just lost. Probably meaningless. But there's a difference between knowing something and believing it. I found myself in the backyard that same afternoon, my eyes scanning the overgrown landscape I'd been planning to reclaim. The shed sat at the far corner, partially hidden by wild lantana and creeping vines. It had a padlocked door, weathered green paint peeling like sunburned skin. The key fit perfectly. Inside, the air hung thick and still, tasting of rust and time. My phone's flashlight carved through the darkness, illuminating horrors arranged like a museum of someone's hidden life. Children's items lay scattered across shelves, a single red sneaker with white laces, colorful hair ribbons still tied in bows, a stuffed rabbit with its seams deliberately torn and restuffed. Stacks of photographs showed interior shots of homes I'd never seen, taken from angles that suggested someone was documenting them without permission. There were counterfeit identification badges with blurred faces, and finally, the journal. The leather was soft from handling. The handwriting inside was meticulous, clinical, the cursive of someone organized and methodical. Subject 4, Maple Street residence. Second floor, eastern bedroom. Opportunity window. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 7-9 p.m. Child present. Another entry. Identified potential in Spring Hills neighborhood. 2-story colonial, corner lot, minimal visibility from adjacent properties. The dates spanned 20 years, the entries numbered in the hundreds. I don't remember calling Sophie. I remember her arriving within 20 minutes. Remember her face draining of color as she understood what we were looking at. We photographed everything with shaking hands before calling the police, our voices small and uncertain on the phone. The officers who arrived were professional but distant, the kind of tired professionalism that suggested they'd been told to care, but had stopped actually caring a long time ago. They cataloged everything with perfunctory precision. 2 weeks later, they called me with their conclusion. Miscellaneous items, no clear leads, possibly abandoned by previous residents or transient individuals. The case was being closed. But 4 days after that call, I walked to the backyard and found the shed chained shut from the outside. Emptied. Someone had returned and collected their things. The paranoia I'd always kept carefully compartmentalized bloomed like a dark flower. I installed security cameras that week, 3 of them, angled to cover every corner of the yard. Motion-detecting lights that flared bright enough to flood the grass in white radiance. I watched the footage obsessively, my laptop glowing in the dark hours of morning, searching for movement that never came. And I baked. God, how I baked. Every anxiety transformed into elaborate pastries, croissants so delicate they practically dissolved on your tongue, croquembouche towers that required hours of precision and focus. I'd work through the nights, my hands moving in practiced rhythms, my mind finally quiet when it had to concentrate on the chemistry of butter and sugar, the temperament of chocolate, the precise moment when dough reached its perfect elasticity. The kitchen became my sanctuary again, just like it had been in childhood, except now I understood that sanctuaries are sometimes just elaborate prisons we build for ourselves. Years have passed now. The shed remains chained shut and I've never opened it. The backyard has been reclaimed, sort of. Dense shrubs and gravel where grass used to grow, a landscape deliberately hostile to lingering or trespassing. My cameras still cycle through their routines. The footage remains blessedly, terrifyingly empty. Sophie asks me sometimes if I still feel safe. I tell her yes, but that's a lie we've both learned to accept. What I've learned is that homes are never what they seem. They're palimpsests of other people's lives and choices, carrying within them histories we can never fully excavate. The previous owners of this house had left me a key and a shed full of horrors, and then they'd come back and taken it all away, leaving only the absence, which is somehow worse than the evidence ever was. I've realized something, though, something that took me years to understand. That fear I carry, that heightened vigilance, that compulsive baking at 3 a.m, these aren't just responses to what I found. They're reminders of something deeper. We cannot control the world around us. We cannot control what happened before we arrived or what strangers might do in the darkness or whether someone else's darkness will someday seep into our carefully constructed light. What we can control is how we choose to live in the aftermath. We can let fear hollow us out, or we can use it to build something. Not a fortress, because those always crack eventually, but a life, imperfect, vigilant, but still filled with beauty and intention and the kind of control that comes not from preventing bad things but from creating good ones. So I keep baking, I keep my cameras running, I keep my yard too hostile for secrets, and I've learned that sometimes the most important lesson isn't that evil exists, it's that so do we, and that our persistence, our creativity, our stubborn refusal to be broken by what we've discovered in the dark places, matters more than we'll ever know. The key, I buried it beneath the roses. Not as closure, but as acknowledgement. Some things we discover are meant to change us. The question is whether we let them destroy us, or whether we transform them into something that sustains us instead. The autumn I turned 17, something poisonous began growing in me. Something that had been planted years earlier, in the silence between my mother's careful words and the things she refused to say. I grew up in rural Montana, in a house that felt like a fortress. My mother, Margaret, built that fortress one cautious rule at a time. She was a middle school librarian who understood the power of stories, which made it all the more devastating that she chose to weaponize them against me. On weekends, she knitted elaborate sweaters, intricate patterns of geometric precision, while tending her garden with the same meticulous care. Everything in our world was controlled, ordered, safe. Or so she claimed. The fortress had one primary enemy, Frank Hollister. Frank lived in a dilapidated mobile home on the far edge of our property, a structure that seemed to decay visibly with each passing season. I was forbidden from approaching it. Margaret's prohibition wasn't casual. It was obsessive, reinforced through whispered phone calls, meaningful silences, and the specific kind of fear that only comes from genuine conviction. Frank Hollister, she told me, had murdered someone, her childhood friend Daniel. Years ago near Miller's Lake, Frank had shot him during a kidnapping attempt. Frank was dangerous. Frank was drunk. Frank was damaged. Frank was to be avoided at all costs. I learned the rest through eavesdropping, the primary skill of lonely children raised by anxious mothers. Frank had military service. He struggled with PTSD and alcoholism. He scavenged for recyclable materials at night, hunted small game, existed in the margins of a town that had already written his epitaph. Everyone knew his name. Nobody spoke to him. The narrative was simple and complete. Frank was dangerous. That narrative became oxygen to me. It became the story I told myself, the one that explained the world's cruelty, that some people were simply marked by darkness, that vigilance was love, that fear was wisdom. By the time I was 17, that narrative had rotted into something more toxic. It had transformed into rage. I watched my mother's hands shake when she gardened, watched her glance toward the tree line where Frank's property began. I heard the tremor in her voice when she spoke his name, and I convinced myself I understood. She was afraid for me. She was protecting something precious. The least I could do was protect her back. I don't remember exactly when the idea crystallized, when protection became revenge. But I remember the feeling. It started as a whisper, then grew louder. Frank Hollister had murdered an innocent man and destroyed my mother's peace. The town had decided to forgive him, or at least to tolerate him, and that tolerance felt like a betrayal of everyone Daniel had meant to his loved ones. Someone should make him answer. Someone should ensure justice. Someone should be me. I spent 3 weeks gathering materials. I researched accelerants, identified the most flammable sections of his structure, planned the execution with the kind of mechanical precision that should have terrified me if I'd been capable of recognizing it as a warning. Instead, it felt purposeful, clean, necessary. I told myself it was for my mother. I told myself it was justice. I didn't examine the darker voice underneath, the one that whispered that destruction felt good, that righteous anger was the most intoxicating high, that I was finally doing something that mattered. On the night I intended to act, the night was so cold, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I was 17 years old, standing at the edge of transformation, carrying gasoline and matches in the terrible certainty of youth. Frank Hollister appeared from the darkness like he'd been waiting for me. He was smaller than I expected, older. His hands were weathered from scavenging, his face mapped with lines that told stories I'd never considered. But what struck me most was his eyes. They held no anger, only a terrible clarity, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "You're Margaret's boy," he said. It wasn't a question. What happened next stretched into 3 hours. We didn't sit in his mobile home. We sat on his crumbling porch and he dismantled every lie I'd ever been told with the careful precision of someone who'd been waiting years to tell the truth. Daniel hadn't been innocent. He'd been a serial predator, a man who assaulted young girls for years while the community looked away. That night at Miller's Lake, Daniel hadn't been attempting to stop a kidnapping. He'd been actively abducting a 13-year-old child. Frank, working late nearby, had intervened. Daniel attacked him with a violence born from desperation and rage. The shooting was self-defense. It was also a death sentence to Frank's life. Daniel's family was wealthy and influential. They had woven a different narrative, one of an unstable drunk and an innocent victim. They had purchased the town's belief, and the town, desperate to maintain its comfortable fiction, had accepted the story. Frank had been isolated to survive. The community's indifference hadn't been mercy. It had been calculated cruelty. Everything I'd built my rage upon was a lie. Not an innocent misunderstanding, but a deliberate fabrication. I think what broke me most wasn't learning the truth about Frank or Daniel. It was understanding that my mother had known. In the days that followed, I confronted her. She didn't deny it. She confessed with the calm of someone whose conscience had been quietly negotiating with her actions for years. She'd known the real story. She'd perpetuated the lie deliberately, not to protect others, but to protect me from what she called complexity and moral ambiguity. She believed I was too fragile to handle truth, so she'd constructed a prison of falsehoods to keep me safe inside it. I left Montana at 18 and never returned. The true horror of that night wasn't Frank Hollister or the darkness I'd almost released. It was understanding that the people we trust most sometimes deliberately conceal truth not out of malice, but out of a love so suffocating it becomes its own form of betrayal. My mother had tried to protect me by controlling my reality, and in doing so, she'd nearly made me into something I couldn't survive becoming. The truth is not enemy of safety. Ignorance is. When we lie to protect people we love, we don't shield them. We disarm them. We remove their ability to navigate a complex world with wisdom and integrity. We rob them of agency in the name of care. The real ambiguity isn't in the world. It lives in the spaces between what we know and what we choose to tell those we love. That's where the real darkness grows. Not in the character of people like Frank Hollister, but in the well-intentioned lies we tell ourselves about why deception is sometimes love. I inherited my grandmother's house when I was 32. That's what I told people when they asked about it. Always the same simple answer delivered with appropriate gratitude. What I didn't mention was how the inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a profound responsibility. To maintain something sacred, to keep alive the specific version of peace that had already begun to mean everything to me. The house itself was a 2-story craftsman, all deep eaves and original craftwork, the kind of place that felt less like a structure and more like a living thing with its own personality. I'd spent summers there as a child, running through the garden while my grandmother tended her roses, learning which floorboards creaked and which remained silent if you stepped carefully. At 25, after a breakup that had gutted me in ways I still don't fully understand, I'd come back for 2 months and slowly remembered how to exist without someone else defining my shape. The house had held me through that too. Its walls didn't judge, its quiet corners didn't demand anything of me. By 2021, 13 years after inheriting it, I'd built something remarkable in that space, not remarkable in any way the outside world would recognize. I was a data analyst, which meant I spent my days finding patterns in spreadsheets and building forecasting models. My life was intentionally, deliberately small. I'd learned early that predictability was a form of luxury, that routine could be not just tolerable, but genuinely nourishing. My mornings began at 6:47 a.m. with coffee on the front porch, where I could watch the neighborhood wake. Evenings meant a walk through the same 3 streets following the same path, noting the small seasonal changes in hedges and flower beds. Weekends belonged to the garden, Rebecca's particular meditation, where I could lose hours in the precise work of propagating cuttings and amending soil. People called me boring. I called it intentional. Everything changed in October 2021, though I didn't know it yet. The day my new neighbor moved across the street, I watched the moving trucks with passing curiosity. Someone left. Someone arrived. This was how neighborhoods functioned. I saw him briefly, a man in his early 40s with shoulders that suggested a life spent lifting things, though his face remained largely unmemorable. I felt no particular way about his arrival. He was simply a new variable in my carefully mapped routine, and variables were things data analysts processed without emotional investment. But variables, I would learn, sometimes became anomalies. It started 3 days later, On an October evening when the light was fading to that particular shade of gray that precedes twilight. I was watering the roses in my front garden when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing at the edge of my property, motionless, watching my hands move through the roses. I looked up directly and he evaporated. Not walked away, but simply ceased to be present, as if I'd blinked away a hallucination. I told myself it was nothing. I continued watering the roses, though something had shifted in my chest, a small tightening I couldn't quite name. The next morning I was collecting mail from the porch. My hands were still learning the rhythm of the day when I saw him, standing in his upstairs window, perfectly still, silhouetted against the interior darkness of his room, watching me collect advertisements and bills. The moment our eyes might have met, he stepped back, folding himself into shadow. That's when I knew something was wrong. Throughout that day, the sensation became unbearable, not quite audible, not quite visible, but absolutely present. I began to notice him in fragments. A shadow moving across his kitchen window as I made lunch. A face appearing at his bedroom window as I sat on the couch. By evening, when I walked to the mailbox to deposit outgoing bills, he stood at the end of my driveway, perhaps 60 feet from where I stood, watching. When I stepped toward him, he retreated toward his own house with a fluid motion that suggested he'd practiced it, choreographed the exact distance between curiosity and escape. My hands were shaking by dinner, though I tried to tell myself this was manageable. I was a rational person. I documented everything meticulously. Times, dates, positions, what he wore. I photographed his license plate. I pulled up the property records and found his name, Derek Masson. When I searched for that name, my blood seemed to forget how to circulate properly. 3 states over the last decade. Stalking charges, voyeurism convictions, a pattern of behavior that read like a script, each state a different performance of the same obsession. That evening, I locked my bedroom door. I'd lived in that house for 13 years and never felt the need to do so. The fear was a new dimension I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the abstract anxiety of knowing something might happen. It was the specific, intimate terror of understanding that someone had chosen me, studied me, decided I was worthy of this particular attention. He'd researched me online before moving. He'd learned my routines. He'd positioned himself directly across from my sanctuary, specifically because he wanted to watch what I did when I thought I was alone. I couldn't sleep. I sat in the darkness with my phone and tried to breathe with intention. At 2:14 a.m., I know the time because I checked my phone when I heard it. There was a sound in my hallway. Footsteps. Unmistakable, undeniable footsteps moving through the house that I thought I'd secured. My heart seemed to stop, then restart in a rhythm that felt dangerous. I peered under my bedroom door into the darkness beyond. Nothing. Then, as my eye adjusted, a shadow moved across the crack of light. Heavy, deliberate, searching. The footsteps approached my door. What I remember most clearly isn't the moment he appeared, though he did. What I remember is the small details, the way my hand trembled when I grabbed my phone, the specific quality of the darkness that made it impossible to see anything clearly, the logic that kept trying to convince me this was a dream, that my mind was catastrophizing, that reasonable people didn't find strangers in their bedrooms at 2 a.m. Then I saw it. A boot, positioned deliberately beneath the door gap. And then, a moment frozen in time, an eye. His eye, pressed against the space beneath the door, peering directly at me in the darkness, studying me the way he'd studied me through windows and from driveways and in the organized obsession of his research. I screamed. Not the controlled alarm of someone calling for help, but the primal howl of an animal recognizing genuine, immediate predation. I screamed and I called 911, and I asked them to send police to my sanctuary, my carefully preserved peace, because something predatory had found its way inside. The police arrived in minutes that felt like hours. They found the house otherwise empty, doors unlocked from the inside. He'd let himself in. The breaking and entering was incidental to the real violation. He'd violated the invisible barriers I'd spent 13 years constructing, the agreement I'd made with myself that if I stayed still and quiet and predictable, I could remain safe. He was arrested the next morning. The interrogation revealed what I'd already understood. I was the target. He'd chosen me from the internet, studied my neighborhood, moved into position, and initiated contact according to some internal timeline that only he understood. It wasn't about anything I'd done. It was about what I represented. A woman living alone in a visible, accessible place. Someone whose routines could be studied and anticipated. Someone whose sanctuary existed precisely because she believed she was safe. That belief, I learned, was a luxury some people recognize and exploit. I moved within weeks to an apartment building with security cameras and controlled access. The garden is gone now. The morning coffee happens on a balcony no one can watch from the street. The walks through the neighborhood have been replaced with a treadmill in a locked room. I've traded my small, beautiful isolation for proximity to cameras and security systems and the knowledge that other people are always nearby. Some might see this as losing my sanctuary, but they would be wrong. The real sanctuary isn't the building itself. It's the understanding that sometimes trusting your instincts to retreat, to lock doors, to become hypervigilant, isn't paranoia. It's survival. I learned something that night that most people are fortunate enough to avoid learning. That the peace we build is fragile, not because we're weak, but because there are people motivated by obsessions we cannot comprehend or predict. That staying alert isn't losing your mind. It's honoring the very real threat some people pose. And that sometimes, the safest sanctuary isn't the one we build with the fewest walls, but the one where we finally accept that walls, and cameras and distance and vigilance exist because they sometimes save our lives. Sometimes trusting yourself when something feels wrong. Not the self that tries to be rational and dismissive, but the deeper self that recognizes predation. Your instinct to flee, to lock doors, to become cautious. These aren't character flaws. They're wisdom. Because safety sometimes requires us to live differently than we planned, to surrender the particular peace we constructed, and to build instead the kind of peace that comes from understanding exactly what we're protecting ourselves from. My sanctuary didn't fail me. It just taught me what I needed to survive. I spent 12 years at Sunrise Manor believing I understood suffering. Psychology degree from ASU hanging on my office wall. I'd spent enough time in geriatric care to recognize the patterns. Memory collapse, confabulation, the mind's desperate attempt to reorganize chaos into narrative. I was good at my job, compassionate, attentive, but firmly rooted in what could be measured and verified. Sentimentality was a luxury I couldn't afford. The elderly needed someone who could distinguish between their fears and reality, someone who could translate their fragmenting experiences into clinical language that doctors understood. My colleagues called me unflappable. My supervisor praised my objectivity. My mother said I was too smart for my own good, too quick to explain away mystery as merely science we hadn't fully understood yet. I took it as a compliment. Eleanor Kessler had been at Sunrise Manor for 3 years when something shifted in me. She was 91, with paper-thin skin and eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond the room's edges. Most residents' families visited less frequently as time passed. Eleanor's daughter, Rebecca, came once a month with a strained smile, always checking her watch. By June 2019, Eleanor had become one of those residents who belonged less to anyone outside the facility and more to the rhythms we'd created for her. Medication schedules, meal times, the rotation of orderlies who'd learned her preferences. I should have seen the signs earlier. The way Eleanor would ask me to sit with her. Not for medical reasons, but simply because she needed to talk. I was trained to listen. Trained, as it turns out, but not prepared. There's a difference. One evening in mid-June, Eleanor asked me to stay after my shift ended. She was sitting in the courtyard watching the Tucson sunset turn the mountains into silhouettes. I sat beside her, already cataloging the signs of decline, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her sentences sometimes spiraled backward through time. "I was married for 63 years, she began. Not unusual. Most of our conversations started with reminiscence. But then Eleanor told me about Harold. He had been, by her account, a man of contradictions, successful in business, catastrophic in his personal life. Decades of infidelity, each discovery another wound that never quite scarred over. She described nights when she'd lie awake listening to his car pull into the driveway at 2 a.m, already knowing where he'd been. She raised 2 daughters. She learned to cook his favorite meals. She stayed. Then came the cancer diagnosis. Pancreatic, aggressive, terminal. Eleanor described watching the man who'd betrayed her waste away, becoming increasingly desperate, increasingly aware that death was no longer an abstraction, but a schedule. One evening, after a particularly bleak doctor's appointment, Harold went into the basement with his pistol. He survived the attempt, a fact that shocked everyone. Too much damage to his face, but his brain remained intact. Eleanor walked me through the aftermath. The hospital stay, the psychiatric evaluation, Harold's refusal to stay in any facility. His shame so profound it seemed to physically bend his spine. She described the exact moment she decided to let him disappear. "He came to me 3 days after the funeral," Eleanor said, her voice remarkably steady. 2 a.m, at the basement door. He was covered in dirt and so thin. He'd been hiding there the whole time, since right after he shot himself, hiding in the same room. Margaret, can you imagine that? I shifted my weight, suddenly aware of it. The clinical part of my brain was already diagnosing. Confabulation, a narrative constructed to make sense of something unbearable. Perhaps Eleanor couldn't accept that her husband had tried to leave her, so her mind rewrote it as presence rather than abandonment. It was elegant, really. Tragic but explicable. "Eleanor," I said carefully, "is it possible that—" "He's not a ghost," she interrupted, her clouded eyes meeting mine with surprising clarity. "I know what you're thinking. Everyone thinks that. But he's not. He's a physical, invisible ghost. There's a difference. He had weight. He needed food. My daughter saw him too the first time. She called the psychiatric emergency team, but Harold locked himself in the basement before they arrived. After that, Rebecca moved me out. She couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear knowing he was there, knowing I was feeding him. Eventually, she locked the basement door permanently. I did what I was trained to do. I asked clarifying questions. How long? 8 months. What did he eat? Leftovers. Whatever Eleanor could smuggle down. Did he ever try to leave? Once, in August. He made it to the backyard before the panic overtook him and he came back. He couldn't face the world. Not with his injuries, not with the false funeral behind him, not with the shame. Eleanor's account was remarkably consistent. No contradictions, no impossible details that logic could easily dismantle. But consistency in delusion is actually quite common. I knew this. I'd studied it. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked quietly. "Because you're the only one who's ever listened without deciding what I am first," Eleanor said. Everyone else had already made up their minds about what was wrong with me. That night I went home and couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table at 3 a.m, tea cooling beside me, something unwinding in my chest. I'd built my entire professional identity on the foundation of rationality, on the ability to hear extraordinary claims and respond with calm skepticism. It had served me well, or so I'd believed. I called my mother, something I did maybe twice a year. She sounded confused at first. I never called. I didn't tell her about Eleanor. Instead, I asked her something I hadn't asked in 2 decades. Where did faith come from? What was it like to believe in something you couldn't prove? She was quiet for a long moment. "It's not about proof," she finally said. "It's about being willing to live with uncertainty. About accepting that some things might be true in ways we don't have language for yet." The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since college. I prayed. I sat on the edge of my bed and closed my eyes and asked for clarity. Or maybe I asked for permission to live without it. I wasn't sure which. I never found definitive proof about Harold. Eleanor died 3 years later peacefully in her sleep. Her daughter donated her belongings and didn't mention the basement. I attended the funeral, watching Rebecca cry with a depth that seemed to suggest more than simple grief. Perhaps she'd seen Harold after all. Perhaps she'd simply carried the guilt of locking away her mother's truth, whatever that truth was. What I learned from Eleanor wasn't the answer to her mystery. What I learned was that certainty is a kind of arrogance, and that the most important part of listening is sometimes being willing to not understand. She'd lived in a liminal space, neither fully believed nor entirely dismissed, and she'd needed someone to sit beside her there without immediately trying to relocate her to the solid ground of diagnosis. I still work with the elderly. I still recognize the signs of cognitive decline. But now I leave room in my assessments for the possibility that sometimes people are telling the truth in ways that don't fit our categories. Sometimes love makes people stay. In basements, in memories, in the spaces between what we can measure and what we need to be real. The lesson Eleanor taught me wasn't about Harold at all. It was about the courage required to admit that the world might be larger than my certainty, and that sometimes the most compassionate response isn't to fix someone's understanding of reality, but to honor their need to believe they've been loved enough that someone wouldn't entirely leave, even if they had to hide to do it. I remember the moment everything shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle change in the way I understood the world, like discovering that the infrastructure holding us up had developed a hairline fracture no one else could see. 23 years I spent crawling through Denver's plumbing systems, learning the language of copper and PVC, of pressure and flow. My name is Victor Rossi, and I became expert in the hidden arteries of this city. I knew where water pooled in old brick joints, where pipes groaned under winter stress, where decades of debris accumulated like archaeological layers. People called me methodical, detail-oriented, the kind of guy who could walk through someone's walls and predict their future maintenance problems before they happened. At night, I restored vintage model trains in my garage, 1950s Lionels with corroded wheels and fractured paint. I'd spend hours hunched over a workbench with magnifying glasses, coaxing tiny mechanisms back to life. I built furniture too, walnut tables and oak cabinets for family members who appreciated craftsmanship but couldn't afford the price tags. My hands knew precision. My mind understood systems. I was, in every practical sense, a man who'd seen everything that pipes and walls could conceal. I was wrong. September 2022, the Riverside Apartments, a 6-story brick structure built in 1974, the kind of building where nobody rich wanted to live. The complaint came through routine channels, residents reporting scratching sounds in their walls at night, items missing from apartments, watches mostly, and jewelry, photographs in frames, all vanishing during sleeping hours. The landlord suspected theft. I suspected rodents. I'd dealt with both before. What I found in the aluminum ventilation ducting wasn't either. The first thing I noticed was the arrangement. A cluster of small bones, perhaps from pigeons or squirrels, positioned in a perfect spiral inside a duct junction. Next to it, aluminum foil had been folded into geometric shapes, triangles interlocking with precise angles, impossible geometry for an animal. My hands trembled as I photographed it. Trembled, though I didn't understand why yet. Then I found the scratches. Not gnaw marks, deliberate gouges in the metal, almost like language. And the smell. Faint, chemical, like copper and something organic I couldn't identify. Mrs. Chen from 4C had reported losing a watch her late husband had worn for 30 years. I pulled the duct where her bedroom connected to the main trunk. Inside, arranged with meticulous care, small stones in concentric circles, her watch positioned at the center like an offering. I sat there on the floor, my back against her bedroom wall, and felt the rational world beginning to crack. I installed cameras, 4 units, high resolution, night vision, all recording to cloud storage. I positioned them throughout the ventilation network, including one directly inside Mrs. Chen's bedroom duct. I told myself I'd document whatever was taking her possessions. Rats don't arrange stones. Rats don't understand value or aesthetics. So I would find something explainable. I would reduce the inexplicable to data. The footage came back on a Tuesday morning. My hands were shaking as I reviewed the files. Not from fear, from the fundamental dissolution of everything I understood to be possible. The creatures moved with predatory grace through the ductwork at 2:47 a.m., and I have to force myself to describe what I saw because even now, years later, the memory feels like it's trying to slide sideways out of my mind. 3 of them, approximately 3 feet tall, moving on limbs that articulated in too many places. No eyes. Pale skin that seemed almost translucent, reflecting the infrared camera's light like oil on water. They moved like insects. That's the only honest comparison, with a clicking sound that made my teeth ache. The leader carried something metallic. When it reached Mrs. Chen's duct, it placed her watch into the spiral of stones. Then it turned, looked directly at the camera. I know what I'm saying. I know how this sounds. But it faced the lens with absolute certainty of the camera's location and position, as though it had always known I was watching. The next unit down. The camera there had been positioned inside Daniel Okonkwo's ductwork, an elderly resident in 3F. The video showed them entering his unit while he slept. One creature held his photograph, his wedding photo from 1982. They repositioned it at the center of an arrangement, twigs in precise geometric patterns, aluminum foil folded into 3-dimensional shapes, stones sorted by size and color. But in apartment 2D, the one where I'd been most careful with camera placement, the one where the duct ran directly over the bed, that's where I watched myself get attacked. The footage shows me in my sleep. I don't know why I watched it. Morbid curiosity, I suppose. Masochism. I watched them lower into the duct above where I decided to wait, watch personally. I watched them recognize the camera. I watched the largest one drop silently onto my arm, and I watched my body react with a scream I didn't remember making. The scratches were deep. 3 parallel lacerations that went through my shirt and drew blood that seemed too dark in the pale light. Infected within 2 days, despite antibiotics. The infection didn't respond to treatment. The scars remain. I reported it all. The footage, the arrangements, the creatures themselves. The authorities responded with evacuation protocols and basement investigation. They found tunnels, real undeniable tunnels connecting the basement of Riverside to 3 adjacent buildings. Dirt packed down by repeated movement. Tunnels that led into spaces beneath the city itself. Where they originated, what they wanted, what their arrangements meant, these questions went unanswered. The official report mentioned environmental contamination and mass hallucination. Environmental contamination that manifested consistently in video evidence. Mass hallucination that produced 3 parallel scars on my arm. I quit plumbing. Moved to a construction company where I work surrounded by people, crowded sites, constant noise, perpetual human presence. No more crawling through walls alone. No more understanding the infrastructure. I became someone who warns obsessively about ventilation sounds, about items going missing, about the spaces beneath older buildings. People listen to the scars on my arm even when they don't listen to my words. But here's what I've learned in the years since. The moral isn't about creatures in the walls or the fragility of safety. It's something deeper. I was a man who believed that understanding systems meant understanding the world. I thought precision and detail could protect me. That knowledge was armor. What I encountered in that ductwork taught me something more humbling. The world contains things we will never understand. Evil, or intelligence, or hunger, or purpose, I still don't know the right word, operates in the places we've decided not to look. It exploits the vulnerable not just physically but psychologically. Residents in old buildings, people without resources to demand inspections, populations we've collectively ignored. And the worst part isn't the creatures themselves. It's that we keep building systems designed to ignore exactly these spaces. We trust pipes and walls to be what we think they are. I can't prove what I encountered exists, but every scratching sound in every ventilation system, every missing item in every old apartment, every resident in every deteriorating building, these are the places where I know something is harvesting from us. Not just objects, but certainty, trust, the belief that the world we've mapped is the entire world. And I can't stop warning people, even when they don't believe me, because understanding the true architecture of our vulnerability is the only defense we have against it. I've always been a man of solitudes, the kind who finds conversation exhausting and silence restorative. Photography chose me more than I chose it, I think. Behind the lens, I didn't have to perform the awkward dance of small talk or navigate the treacherous waters of genuine connection. My subjects never asked for more than I could give. They simply existed in that singular moment of exposure, and I captured them truthfully, without expectation of reciprocation. When I bought the bungalow on Elm Street in Albuquerque 3 years ago, it wasn't the house that called to me. It was the detached garage. 2,000 square feet of climate-controlled sanctuary where I could store my camera equipment, my lighting rigs, my collection of vintage backdrops that had cost more than some people's cars. The house itself was modest, unremarkable, built in the 70s with low ceilings and a certain dated charm. But the porch faced west, and on clear evenings the sky there burned like nothing else on earth. Those evenings became the architecture of my life. I'd sit with Beaumont, my rescue dog, an ancient golden retriever with a graying muzzle and patient eyes, and we'd watch the light die together. I never had to explain myself to Beaumont. He simply leaned against my leg, and in that lean was understanding. Photography during the day, stargazing at night, and the predictable rhythm of solitary living in between. I'd built a life that made sense to me. Then Paul Hendricks moved in next door. "Here, brother," he'd said during our first meeting, pressing a brass key into my palm with a grin that seemed too large for his narrow face. "For emergencies. Neighbors look out for neighbors, right?" I should have known then. Should have recognized the excessive warmth, the way his eyes held mine a beat too long. But I was 31 and naive in the way that isolated people are. I mistook neighborly interest for acceptance and accepted the key without the resistance my instincts were quietly signaling. The escalation was so gradual that at first I attributed the unease to my own neurosis. He'd appear on my porch just as I was returning home, calling out something casual about having seen me drive past his house an hour earlier. He'd mention details about locations I'd photographed, places he shouldn't have known about unless I'd told him, which I hadn't. In March, he showed up with a coffee mug, placing it on my front step. "Left this here last time I stopped by," he said. "Didn't want you to think I stole it." I'd never invited him inside. The fear arrived like that slow tide in my nightmares, so gradual I didn't recognize it as drowning until the water was already past my lips. I began finding small alterations in my space. My camera settings shifted subtly. Zoom levels changed. Photo albums reorganized into different folders. A bookmark appeared in my dog-eared copy of Ansel Adams. The camera. A cigarette butt sat in my ashtray, the one I'd kept religiously clean for years. Someone was entering my home. That night I sat on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m, and something cracked open inside me. The sanctuary I'd built wasn't a sanctuary at all. It was a glass box and I'd been observed. The intrusion wasn't theft. It was something far more intimate. Someone had touched my things, moved through my private spaces, left evidence not of taking, but of presence. It felt like violation articulated through objects. I confronted Paul the next afternoon, my voice steadier than my hands. "You've been in my house," I said. "I want to know why." His face cycled through expressions rapidly. Surprise, something darker, then a false confusion that was almost worse than admission would have been. "Man, I don't know what you're talking about. The key was it was for emergencies." "You used it," I said. "You've been using it." "That's crazy. I don't need your—" He trailed off, but his eyes had shifted. He was lying, and he knew I knew. Instead of defending himself further, he simply left, walking back toward his house with the hurried gait of someone fleeing a scene. Within 48 hours, he'd listed his house for sale. Within 2 weeks, he was gone. The police report filed in my name went nowhere. No theft, no damage to report. They classified it as a neighborhood dispute, a miscommunication between two people who'd gotten off on the wrong foot. The officer taking my statement had that look, the one that suggested I was paranoid, that I'd made too much of something small. But I hadn't imagined the cigarette butt, or the bookmark, or the coffee mug. I spent the spring of 2023 installing comprehensive security systems, cameras at every corner, motion sensors on all entry points, reinforced locks that required keys I alone possessed. I changed the locks on every door, including the garage. I rekeyed everything, and slept with my phone nearby, checking the security feed at irregular intervals throughout the night. The videos showed nothing but empty driveways and still garage doors, but the vigilance became its own kind of existence. What strikes me now, looking back, is how thoroughly the incident altered my interior landscape. I still photograph, but the presence behind my eyes has changed. I'm always partially removed from the moment, always aware of angles and exits and who might be watching. The art I make feels different, more documentary than creative, more evidence than expression. Beaumont senses the shift. Sometimes he reacts to empty rooms, his ears pricking toward nothing I can detect, and I respond with immediate investigation. I check closets and blind corners not because I truly expect to find anything, but because the possibility has become a permanent resident in my consciousness. The uncertain threat is worse than a certain one. I'll never know what Paul wanted, whether his intrusions were voyeurism or theft or something more sinister. That ambiguity is the real violation. Here's what I understand now, after months of sleeping lightly and years of checking locks. A home is only a sanctuary if you actively defend it. Trust is currency that must be spent carefully, never offered freely to strangers who appear too warm, who give too much before being asked. Casual access is how violations begin, not with forced entry but with extended hands and offered keys, with the gradual erosion of boundaries that no one notices until the threshold has already been crossed. The bungalow is still my home, still my refuge. The porch still faces west and the sunsets remain transcendent. But I no longer sit unprepared on that porch, back to the yard, unaware of what moves behind me. I observe now, always. I've learned that solitude and safety aren't automatic companions, that being alone can feel less like peace and more like exposure. The careful observer sees more than the carefree one ever could, sees danger in casual gestures, predation wearing a neighborly smile. I don't know if Paul ever returned after his house sold. I don't know if he watches properties from afar, if he found another key to leave, another home to enter while its owner lived in beautiful, terrible darkness. What I do know is this: every friendship requires vulnerability, but vulnerability without vigilance is just another word for invasion waiting to happen. Some lessons are etched not in wisdom but in fear, and they reshape everything they touch.